Welcome back. All right, so I want to do a list video. Now, one thing that I've seen conversations about on the internet before is eras that don't have a Stanley Cup and trying to rank eras without Stanley Cups, this kind of thing. So I'm going to take a shot at it. There are no current runs on this board. So before anybody asks where are the Toronto Maple Leafs, the current run is still going on. So for teams that are still top-rated teams, top 5, top 10 in the NHL types, there's no point in me putting them on the board at this stage because we don't know how that's going to end. We can guess how it's going to end. We can have that debate of how it's going to end. But I wanted to talk about some recent and some further back ones. And these are just while I've been watching hockey. Because otherwise it would be, hey, this team had a lot of points during that era. Isn't that entertaining? And it just doesn't work. So number 12, and the first two on the board are actually player centric. So for St. Louis, the only team that's on this board twice, the Brett Hull era. The Brett Hull era, during that run, the furthest that team got was round two. And when Brett Hull left St. Louis, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not Brett Hull was the right guy, and was he ever going to? And then he won. He won himself a Stanley Cup in Dallas, and then he won a Stanley Cup in Toronto and Detroit as well. And so, yeah, his time in St. Louis just did not end with the Stanley Cup. Of course, he celebrated the 2019 Stanley Cup, but during his era there, it didn't happen. Which brings me to another era that I wanted to make mention of, and this is with Buffalo, and that is the Dominik Hasek era. So there's one final that comes out of that, but considering how fantastic Dominik Hasek was during that time in Buffalo, it's a little bit surprising they never won a Stanley Cup with him. He, of course, would leave the team, ends up winning a Stanley Cup with Detroit, much like Brett Hull as well. So both of these players unable to win Stanley Cups with teams they were with for a long time, surprisingly so, and ended up going elsewhere and winning. And both of them won Stanley Cups in Detroit. But of course, like I said with Hull, he won one in Dallas first. Which brings us to number 10, and now we're into a period of time for the Chicago Blackhawks. So for the Chicago Blackhawks, this is not as long of an era as some of the others on the board. So 1989-90 through 1992-1993. They had a Stanley Cup final in 1992. And they were very good. This was the Mike Keenan era. This is with Ed Belfour. This is with Jeremy Roenick, Chris Chelios. And it was a dominant team during that time. Of course, they steamrolled to a Stanley Cup final against Pittsburgh in 92, and Pittsburgh swept them in that final. So for the Chicago Blackhawks, a little bit of a surprise. They never won a Stanley Cup during that era. Of course, they would win one in 2010, then 2013 and 2015 as well. They had some other good years in between 1993 and when they won the Cup in 2010, but to me, that was the era that looking back, it's kind of surprising they didn't win a Stanley Cup. Now, next team on the board is Washington. For Washington, this is from 83-84, so 1983-1984, through to 1989-90. I should put 2 on here, because otherwise it looks like I'm talking about those 2 seasons, right? So from 83-84 till 1990, they ended up going to one conference final. That's it. But the Washington Capitals of the 80s were a very good team. They had some very solid numbers in the regular season. Could not get over the hump in the playoffs. 1990, they did get to the conference final, and then things kind of fall apart after that. So that was the era that I chose for the Capitals. There have been other eras for the Capitals. That's the one that stands out. And what's interesting is, if not for the 2018 Stanley Cup, I would have put the era for the Washington Capitals and included that 2010 meltdown against Montreal. However, they do win the Stanley Cup in 2018. That's all part of the Ovechkin era, so it doesn't get on the board. But the Capitals from the mid-'80s until 1990 do. They were a very good team, and I really rooted for them. They just could not get it done. Next on the board, number 8, is an era for Boston that goes from 1987-88 through until, so from 87-88 until 1993-94, they had 2 Stanley Cup finals during that. So we'll put 2 finals on the board here. For the Boston Bruins, just Calgary, or not Calgary, Edmonton. They didn't play Calgary in the final. If they had, who knows, they might have won. But even Calgary in 89, I don't know that anybody was going to stop them. But in 88 and 90, Boston gets to the final. They can't get over the hump. And again, that's with Ray Bourque, Andy Moog, Cam Neely, Adam Oates later on in this run as well. Really solid teams. Joey Juneau, of course, coming out of nowhere, and he was a star out of the gate. But for Boston, they could not win that Stanley Cup final either year against the Oilers, whether it's 88 or 90. They only won 1 game between those 2 Stanley Cup finals. Number 7 on the board, the New York Rangers. And this is a run that goes from 2011-2012 through until... So I qualify the year as ending when the team either has not a great year or misses the playoffs. That's why I've got it the way that I do. 1 Stanley Cup final for the New York Rangers along the way through until 2016-2017, where I consider that era to have ended. That, of course, is with Henrik Lundqvist in net and a pretty solid overall team that was in contention every year and looked like they could very well win a Stanley Cup when they did get to that final, just were not able to get that done at the end of the day. So for the New York Rangers, a team still looking for their first Cup win since 1994. They're right now a contending team, but again, I can't look at this current year and say, well, they haven't won a Cup yet, because we've got a lot of time left with Igor Shesterkin, and odds are at some point in time he should take them to a Stanley Cup, right? Number 6 on the board, the Anaheim Ducks, and this is from 2012-2013 through until 2017-2018. So 2017-2018, and they had 2 conference finals during that run. For the Anaheim Ducks, they were favorites on various lists from 2013 through to 2018. Of course, 2018, they got taken out pretty quickly by the Vegas Golden Knights. But for Anaheim, yeah, it was really, I would imagine, frustrating for Ducks fans watching this team consistently at or near the top of the standings and just not able to get that win when they need it. They didn't get into a Stanley Cup final. Now, what makes it feel a little bit better is that 2007 Stanley Cup win, and I did have to consider that with eras. Like, well, how far after a Stanley Cup win can I say the era's changed? And so I had to go back and forth a little bit on number 5 on the board. Number 6, I was like, nope, that was a different era. Number 5, so for the Philadelphia Flyers, I qualified it as going from 1979-80 through until 1986-87. And they had 3 Stanley Cup finals during that time. So I debated about whether or not to have it from 81-82 to 86-87, but I thought, you know what? 79-80, they did go to the Stanley Cup final. They didn't take a whole lot of steps back. But by this point, they were already kind of distancing themselves with their roster from the Broad Street Bullies era. Their roster changed quite a bit. Their goaltending changed quite a bit by the time you get to 1980. So I felt like, yeah, there's enough changes there from their Stanley Cup victories in back-to-back years to qualify that as a different era. But again, just trying to go through and figure this out. Go, all right. And so again, you guys can let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, including teams that you feel like went through an era that I don't have on the board and arguments for that. But for me, Philadelphia, good team, good in the playoffs, 85 final, 87 final after the 80 final, and a different goaltender for each Stanley Cup final, which is odd, but there you go. For the Philadelphia Flyers, consistently a very good team in the 80s, just no Stanley Cups for them in the 80s. Number 4, and we're back to St. Louis, the second St. Louis mention on the board, and this is from 1997-98 through until 2003-2004. They spent a lot of money. They spent a lot of money on this roster before we had the salary cap, of course. They had 1 conference final during that time. Almost put 1 final, and I'm like, nope, they didn't get back to the final till 2019. Keep it straight. But yeah, 1 conference final for that team that spent a lot of money. And they had very good regular season results, and then in the playoffs, it just didn't work. Roman Turek could be great during the regular season, and then in the playoffs, it just didn't work for them. And there were other goaltenders during that era as well. St. Louis very nearly had that figured out, I thought, but again, not able to get through that. And what's interesting is 97-98 is after Brett Hull has left. So I feel like after Hull leaves, you're into a different era. And so for St. Louis, if you want to look at that and go, well, it's kind of one big continuous era, you can. But I would qualify it as a bit different because you don't have Oates, you don't have Hull. Everything had kind of changed on the roster, so I do qualify them as two different entries on this board. Number 3, and I've heard this argument a lot. The Vancouver Canucks, the most talented team to not win a Stanley Cup. So from 2008, 2009 through to 2012, 2013, and of course, infamously or famously, one Stanley Cup final, that being in 2011. I don't know the whole argument of they're the most talented team that didn't win a Stanley Cup. I understand why that's there, but if I looked at that roster and I compared it to St. Louis in the late 90s, to Philadelphia in the early 80s, to some of those Ducks rosters, I'm not sure how much better I would find Vancouver than those teams. But 2010-2011 was a magical regular season that led to a Stanley Cup final where they lost it in 7. So the Vancouver Canucks, that's as close as you can get. They've done it twice. The other Vancouver run is not on here. It wasn't long enough for me to consider it an era. And then the early 2000s Vancouver Canucks, not really an era either. It was a couple of good years. So to me, an era has to be at least 3 years, I think, to really qualify. And so the Vancouver Canucks from the late 2000s and into the 2010s, that does qualify. But yeah, rough time for Vancouver fans with the way that ended. Number 2, we're going to Ottawa for number 2. So for the Sens, this one extends from 1998-99. Almost said 88-89, didn't I? Which would have been great because that's before they came into the league. So 2007-2008, they did have a Stanley Cup final in 07. But ultimately, for Ottawa, they come up short, and they had some great teams throughout that. Now, of course, they also had some kind of mental block with the Toronto Maple Leafs. Early 2000s and 99, I believe, as well. They'd play Toronto and they couldn't beat Toronto. It was the weirdest thing. They'd come into this with a great lineup. They were top to bottom, just fantastic, and then Toronto would just beat them. And you could tell that a lot of it was psychological with that Ottawa team, which was a discussion point with the Ottawa team until the 2007 run to the final. Ultimately, they were unsuccessful, ran into a Ducks team in the 07 final that just wasn't going to lose. But yeah, great run by Ottawa for a long time. They just didn't quite get over the hump. Which leads me to number 1, and this I have seen others talk about, that it is remarkable that the Sharks never won the Stanley Cup. And they didn't. From 2003-2004 until, I'm going with 2013-2014. And so during that run, the Sharks had 3 conference finals. 3 conference final appearances, and ultimately not able to get to the final until 2016, which was after a bit of a reset in 2014-2015 by the team. So it was a long run. The 2016 team almost gets over the hump, but for me, I'm going with the 2003-2004 roster through to 2013-2014 for this video because everything lined up for them. They had great goaltending, all the scoring in the world, good defense, everything you would want, just not a Stanley Cup ring to come out of it. So there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always, on eras that you feel surprised looking back on that they didn't win a Stanley Cup championship. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.